The birds were chirping, and a thick mist clung stubbornly to the low-lying hollows. The sun was bright in a cloudless sky, already starting its steady climb on its daily journey to the west. It's gonna be a beautiful day, Abby thought, as she shut her car door with a solid thud. She looked up at Sean's house standing before her and reflected on how it had looked a few short weeks before. Amazing what a little paint and some new siding will do for a house, she said, talking to herself as she shook her head in wonder. She started towards the house, rubbing her arms vigorously against the morning chill that was clinging as stubbornly as the mist. Abby looked around, not seeing Jack Braggs's big crew cab Ford truck in the drive, only Sean's Wagoneer. She hoped Sean hadn't gone off with him. Then she flushed, feeling excited at the prospect of maybe finding Sean home alone. As she neared the front porch, she admired the new staircases that Jack and Sean had built on either side moving up, curving to enter the front porch from either end. She ran her hand admiringly across the newly finished wood of the railing. She turned away to head around to the rear of the house where she knew Sean had been living in the large kitchen, where they had sat around the night before. As she started away, she heard drilling coming from the front of the house, so she retraced her steps and climbed the new steps to the front entrance and knocked firmly. The drilling stopped for a moment, then started again, so Abby knocked harder. When the drilling stopped a second time, she called out, "Sean, anyone home? Sean?" She waited a long moment, then knocked and called again, then waited. Just as she raised her hand to knock a fourth time, a voice from behind her startled her and she jumped. What a pleasant surprise! Don't tell me I missed dinner. It was dinner, wasn't it? Not breakfast? Abby turned and didn't see Sean for a moment, then looked down and saw him standing on the ground in front of the porch. She then realized he must have come out of the door in the basement underneath the porch. "Oh, you scared me," she said, breathless for a moment. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sean flashed a genuine smile her way. "Abby, you're welcome any time. You should know that. You could never intrude," he said, looking up at her and holding her gaze. He motioned with his head. "Go on in. The door's open. I'm downstairs." He started back in, and then stopped. "Hey, Abby," he said, getting her attention. "I'm glad you're here." Then he disappeared back into the house. She smiled to herself, feeling her cheeks color. She felt giddy like a schoolgirl and told herself to calm down. She was a mature woman. She opened the door entering the foyer and made her way down to the steps to the basement. "Back here," she heard Sean call from the back section, and she headed towards the sound of his working, guided by a light that shone through an open door. "What are you doing up so early?" Abby asked as she stepped through the low doorway, looking around cautiously. Sean took a minute to answer. She found him struggling over a new circuit box. "Oh," he said while he worked, "just trying to finish getting this service box in. There's practically no Edison coming into the house, only in the kitchen, and it's old. The service will eventually handle the whole house. There we go, all done." So, he turned his attention to Abby. "To what do I owe this visit so early in the morning? You want some coffee? Follow me." He stepped past her before she could answer, so she quickly followed behind. "I wasn't sure you'd remember where my parents live, so I thought I'd pop out to see if you did, or if you wanted me to fetch you," she said as they made their way upstairs to the rear of the house. "Oh," he said, sounding disappointed. "Here I was hoping you came back to ravage me. How do you like your joe?" he asked as he retrieved 2 heavy ceramic mugs from the counter. "Which question do you want me to answer first?" she shot back playfully. They both chuckled. "Did Jack leave already?" "Yeah, about 3 hours ago. Before first light. He ought to be home any time now." "Oh, so we're all alone, huh?" she asked shyly. "Yep, unless you got Jesse out in your car, we are," he answered, locking eyes with her. "Well, in that case," she said in a husky voice, "I'll answer the second question first, or the coffee will get cold." Sean figured anything he could answer to that would only sound kind of dumb, so he set the mugs back down on the counter. Then he reeled her into his arms. They kissed for a long moment, and then Abby pulled away, breaking the kiss and tugging Sean by the hand. She led Sean across the room to his cot. Afterward, Sean lay on his back with Abby curled around him, with her head against his shoulder, absently running her fingers through his hair on his chest. "It seems like a dream," she said in a far-off voice. What's that? Sean answered, relaxing, not opening his eyes, enjoying the moment. You know, this. Last night. This house and what you've done with it. What we found. It all seems like some kind of weird, wild dream. Sean lifted his head and kissed the top of hers. I have to admit, when Jesse and I got home last night, we were so excited we could hardly sleep. We talked almost all night, Abby confided. Yeah, it was pretty out of hand, wasn't it? I was shocked, Sean answered, slowly stroking her hair. She lifted her head, looking at him with a questioning gaze. Shocked? You didn't seem shocked in the least, or excited for that matter. It's kind of like trying to spot something at dusk, or in a tricky light, he explained. You know what I mean? She shook her head no. Well, in a funny light, when things aren't clear, and you try to look directly at something, it disappears. You can't tell it's there, but if you relax and try to look at either side of it, but not directly at it, you can usually focus on it clear as a bell. You see, right now, I'm trying to relax and stay calm and look to either side. Believe you me, nobody's more excited than I am. Wow, honestly, I don't know how you're staying so calm. Maybe this'll help change things. Later in the kitchen, after they shared a cold shower in his improvised shower, erected outside with a 55-gallon drum, Abby sat at the table shivering. Sean came across the room, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. Here you go, he said cheerfully. 1 coffee, 2 lumps, no cream. Thank you, she said, accepting the mug eagerly. My God, I don't know how you stand it, she said, sipping her coffee. The coffee? You don't like it? He replied in a hurt tone. She nodded her head vigorously. No, the coffee's great. I mean the cold shower. My God, I don't think I'll ever be warm again. She sipped her coffee greedily. Well, it's all a question of mind over matter, he said, chuckling. Really? She asked, looking at him suspiciously. Abby just looked at him. Boy, you're in a different mood all of a sudden, she observed. I don't know, he said, turning the glass-covered letters towards her so she could read them. Something about finding gold in the house and making love to the most beautiful creature in the world sort of starts the day on the right foot. You know what I mean? He smiled at her. Thank you. She blushed and began reading the notes again. What do you think? He asked, turning serious. I don't know, she said, looking pensive. I think he's trying to tell us, or Myra rather, in the last part, where he talks about their dreams being in the wishing well, but for the life of me, I don't know what. Anything else? He prodded. She looked at the note. Well, now that you mention it, the last part, the part I was talking about, is barely legible. I mean, Wilt's writing leaves a lot to be desired, but that you can hardly make out at all. Are you sure that's what it says? He prodded. She looked at it again, and turned it slightly to a different angle. Finally, she looked up and nodded. Yes, I'm sure. I agree, he said. Okay, I have an idea. Try this. Wilt gets an attack of conscience, or guilt, or whatever, and has a bad feeling. Kind of a sixth sense. The shit's about to hit the fan. Sean paused, to let Abby follow him and sipped his own coffee. He writes the note and leaves the bar as proof of what he says. Then before the fight starts, for some reason they hide their personal stashes they were carrying in the well, so the Yankees or whoever wouldn't get it. Then in the heat of the battle, Wilt makes his way up here, scribbles the rest of the note so Myra may find it and be set for life. Then he buys it, so do the others with him. Myra's so broke up she doesn't come in here ever again, even though she lives here the rest of her life. She just boards it shut and keeps a shrine of her soldier. He ended and sipped his coffee, and gazed at Abby. That's stretching it, don't you think? She said, raising her eyebrows. Sean shrugged. Yeah, I guess it is, but it works. Sort of. But if it's true, or even close, it means there's more gold somewhere around this house, and even more hidden not too far away. Want some more? He said with a nod, and crossed the room and returned with the coffee pot. It's fantastic, isn't it? Almost too much to believe, Abby said, holding out her mug to accept more of the steaming brew. Yes, it is, Sean agreed, but it's hard to argue with what we found last night. Yes, but couldn't somebody have found it? I mean, it's been there, what, 120? 125 years or so? That's a long time for something to be lost. Sean sipped his coffee, nodding his head in agreement, then smiled. But think of the fun we'll have looking for it. Abby snapped her fingers. The wishing well. Sean, those pictures that were in the box. Where are they? Abby asked urgently. Sean shrugged and drained his coffee. On the bed, I think. Hold on a sec. He got up and headed up to the bedroom where they found the gold. Abby couldn't wait. She followed right on his heels. The wishing well, she repeated, going up the steps. They entered the room, sunlight streaming in through the new windows. Abby picked up the old photos off the bed until she found the one she wanted, the one showing the young couple posing against the stone well. She held it up eagerly for Sean to see. He took it from her and studied it closely with his sharp eye for detail. Only one problem, he said as he studied the photo. Abby looked at him, the question in her gaze. You can't tell where this was taken, he said, handing it back to her. She looked at it, stricken. You could see the side of the house in the background, but it wasn't clear and there were no shadows, windows, or even discerning shapes to give an indication where the photo could have been taken. Abby looked up and Sean was out in the hall, looking out the window to the backyard. She followed his gaze, held onto his arm, and put her head on his shoulder. There's no wishing well out there, he said, but a lot can change with time. It could have been filled in for some reason, but without knowing its location, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. It makes sense though, if you think about it. His voice strayed off, like he could see into the past, in the skirmish that took place here. The attack has begun. They know it's hopeless, but they don't want the gold to fall into their enemies' hands. They can't run off and leave it, so they stay and fight, knowing they're gonna die. They see the well, and as the fighting begins, they toss the gold in and take cover in the house. Wilt makes his way upstairs and fights from his lover's bedroom and leaves the last part of his note in his haste. How did it go? He asked, searching his mind for the right words. Abby supplied them from memory. See that Colonel Mosby gets the note I left and sees the package. It's our dreams. Then the part he added. You can find them in the wishing well. Love, Wilt. A single tear ran down Abby's cheek. It's so sad, she said, digging tighter into Sean's arms. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I can almost see it happening, Sean said, staring off into the distance, the way only a combat veteran can. Abby wiped her tear with her hand. Do you think it was ever found? She questioned, trying to gaze off to the same place Sean was, but failing. No, he said, shaking his head after a long moment, but we will still need to cover that possibility and find out what we can about Mosby's Rangers, the names in the letter, and what happened here. That will tell us whether it's still out there or not, I think. I know my daddy has at least one book about Mosby. I'm sure he'll let you read it if you ask him, and my brother's sort of the expert on the local Civil War lore here, Abby offered. Sean looked at her funny. I thought you didn't trust your brother as far as you could toss him. Abby shook her head. I didn't say tell him about the gold, or the note for that matter, but an ex-soldier's interest in Mosby's Rangers is only natural. Don't you think? Some of the stories are quite fascinating, Abby said, cocking her head to one side while looking at Sean, like she was testing her theory by the way he looked. Mosby's Rangers, huh? Sean grunted. Guerrillas. He said the word slowly, and his eyes went far away again. If that's the case, my interest won't be an act. I spent 20 years doing the same kind of thing. Come on, he said, his eyes coming back to here and now. Hadn't we better get going if we're going to make that dinner? Oh God, I almost forgot, Abby said, gasping sharply, bringing her open hand to her mouth. Sean chuckled and put their coffee mugs in the sink, then headed for the door. As he was letting Abby out the door, there was a sharp buzzing sound. Abby looked at Sean questioningly. Sean met her glance and frowned. What's that? Abby asked. The phone, Sean replied, moving back to the counter. I didn't know you had a phone yet, Abby said. Sean shook his head. It's not mine, it's work's, and so the office can always be in touch. I'll give you the number when I get off. I'll wait in the car, Abby said, heading out the door to give Sean some privacy. Sean watched her go. When she rounded the corner of the house, he answered, Murphy. They talked lightly after leaving Sean's. Abby proved her prowess behind the wheel of the nimble little BMW as they hurried to her house to pick up Jessie and get to her parents without being late for their Sunday family dinner. They arrived with time to spare, and Jessie hurried up the walk to help her gran with the meal. Abby hung back with Sean, introducing him to the two men who were sitting on the porch with her father. He rightly assumed the younger of the two was her brother Bob. Bob shook Sean's hand with clammy aloofness. Sean instantly didn't like him, but was careful to keep his feelings neutral so as not to be rude to Abby or her parents. The other man was introduced to him as Uncle Charlie. Not an uncle at all, but an old-time friend of the family and competitor in the antique business. "Pleased to meet you, young man," the old man said cheerfully. He was short with thick glasses that made his eyes look 3 times their normal size. Sean was put in mind of a cartoon character from his youth, Mr. Magoo. He had a surprisingly strong handshake for a man his age. He looked old enough to be Abby's grandfather. "How's the house coming, boy?" Abby's father said, offering his hand to Sean, decidedly friendlier than on his first visit. "Fine, sir. Good to see you again," Sean greeted. "Call me Cyrus, boy. I ain't too comfortable with all that sirring," Abby's father said, sitting down again. Before Sean could answer further, Abby jumped in. "You can see for yourself, Daddy, when you go out there with us later and took a look at its contents," Abby scolded. Abby, don't," he whined. "Don't Abby me, Daddy. You promised." Okay, Cyrus said, holding up his hands in defeat. "Anything for my little girl," he consoled. "Don't coddle me, Daddy," Abby warned. "Well, y'all stay out here and gab with Sean. I'm going in to help Mama and Jessie." She kissed him quickly on the cheek and went in the house. Cyrus turned to Uncle Charlie. "The boy here bought a house from Abby, one of the old deserted fixer-uppers." Both men laughed as if some private joke. Uncle Charlie looked closely at Sean. "That so, boy?" he asked, blinking his huge eyes. "Yes, sir. You look like you got more sense than that, boy." Both men cackled again. Cyrus continued. "Seems the place has been boarded up for years and was filled with some sort of valuable antiques." Both men cackled gaily. Bob sat there looking on with cool indifference to them all. "You'll have to excuse Daddy and Uncle Charlie, Mr. Murphy. They are easily amused, you might say," Bob said, his lip curling up in a smile. "What sorts of things did you find?" Uncle Charlie asked, his ancient head shaking slightly, his old eyes gleaming bright. Sean shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, I don't know. The usual stuff, I guess. Furniture, china, even clothes. Silver, bookcase, books, big old grandfather clock, a couple of guns. I don't know. There's these trunks full of things I haven't been through, except to carry it out of the house." Sean paused and noticed all 3 men staring at him. "Carried it out? Boy, what did you do with it all?" Cyrus asked, sounding puzzled. "We put it all in a big old army surplus mess tent that belongs to a friend of mine," Sean explained. "You put it all in that tent, boy?" Cyrus asked. Sean noticed all 3 were on the edge of their seats, so he played dumb. "Well, only the downstairs stuff. I left everything upstairs for now. A lot of clothes are moth-eaten and ragged, not to mention the upholstery on the furniture. But there sure is a house full of it," Sean finished, bobbing his head like a tourist. "For goodness sake, you can't be serious," Uncle Charlie piped up. Cyrus shrugged indifferently. "Well, lad, if Cyrus don't want to take a look at it all, I sure will," Charlie offered. "I might be interested myself," Bob said warily, "if they're good enough quality. I don't peddle junk." "Now hold on, y'all. I got first dibs. I didn't say I wasn't interested. I just don't go running off, chomping at the bit over nothing at my age," Cyrus huffed. "How did you ever find a place like that?" Bob asked, envy dripping from his voice. Sean shrugged again. "Your sister showed it to me. I was looking for something in this area. When I mentioned I liked the look of some of the old homes and said I'd be working with my hands, she took me up to it. She tried to talk me out of it once she saw how shabby it was, but I fell in love with the place. Although I must admit, something needing less work would have been better," Sean said seriously. "But live and learn. It's coming along nicely, though," Sean admitted, smiling. "What's the name of this house, Mr. Murphy?" Bob asked. "Call me Sean, and I don't quite know what you mean," Sean questioned seriously. "Oh, I'm sorry. You see, Sean, their owners named most all the old states around here. It's a status thing back then, I think," Bob pondered. "Well, Bob, I can't help you, though I think I get where you're coming from. The only thing I ever heard, it was called the Old Connell place, I think. Amazing, Bob said, thinking out loud. What? Sean asked. Oh, nothing, Bob answered. So, Sean, did you find any of the old Connells out there? Bob threw in. No, can't say that we did, but we did find all their stuff. Sean grinned. Both older men cackled, and Bob glowered. Come and get it! A female voice boomed from inside, so the men shuffled inside and sat down to a feast of slow-cooked ham, lima beans, collard greens, and boiled potatoes. A real southern dinner. The first part of the meal, there wasn't much conversation. Everyone was busy passing plates and eating heartily. Things slowed down, and the conversation picked up again as they lingered over second helpings. So, Mr. Murphy, what brings you to settle in our pleasant little country? Uncle Charlie asked, his big eyes blinking. Well, I retired from the service, and I've started working as a security consultant for a big firm in Washington, and I have to live within an hour's drive. So here I am, he said, taking another slab of ham onto his plate. Fascinating, Uncle Charlie observed. Oh, Daddy, Abby spoke up. Do you still have that book about Mosby? Cyrus thought a moment. Should be in the bookcase, child. Why? I was telling Sean a little something about them and how they operated around here. Being a retired soldier, I thought he might enjoy reading about them, especially since he's living in the area where they roamed. More than that, Bobby spoke up. If I'm not mistaken, the old Connell place is called Wheatland. If I'm right, Mr. Murphy, you've purchased a property that Mosby used to frequent. Fascinating. Tell me more, Sean replied, trying to keep his voice even. Not a whole lot to tell, really. Mosby and Connell got along well. Connell would hide out a number of Mosby's men from time to time, and Mosby himself would be an occasional dinner guest. And if I'm not mistaken, Mosby was hidden there for some time after surgery to remove a bullet, as I recall, nearly fatal. What got y'all talking about him anyway? Bob asked. Sean shrugged. There's this room in the house that had been all shot up, and I dug a slug out of the bedpost and asked Abby about a battle in the area. The women began cleaning the table, and brought out a nice cobbler for dessert. A battle? Uncle Charlie scoffed. Mr. Murphy, this entire area was a battlefield. Back and forth, day to day, month to month, year to year. They all passed through here one time or another. Lee, Longstreet, Jackson, and Stewart are household names. Names you know even if you don't know much about the war. But Mosby, the Gray Ghost, this is where he thrived. They called the area Mosby's Confederacy, and he ruled here, absolutely. Once had his horse shoed at the smithy out front, where the Dalton shop is. The Federals tried for nearly 2 years to stop him, and they never did. The men took turns telling Sean their favorite Mosby tale, and he listened fascinated. They told him of train robberies, wagon train raids, and even kidnapping a Union general. Sean could tell all three of them considered themselves somewhat experts, each trying to outdo the other with some obscure tale or fact. The women finished clearing the remaining dessert dishes as the conversation continued. Let me ask you something, Sean, if I may, Bob asked, warming up to his subject. Are you a treasure hunter? He asked, looking Sean directly in the eye. The question took Sean by surprise for a heartbeat, but then he was able to recover. Jessie, hearing the question as she carried the dishes to the kitchen, was stunned and dropped her load, and they crashed to the floor, taking the attention away from Sean's answer. I'm sorry, Jessie said, looking at Sean, her eyes wild, but trying to remain calm. She bent down to pick up her mess. Sean moved to help her pick up the mess. It's okay, Sean. I can get it, she told him. Sean gave her a wink, and she smiled, reassured. You're not going to get started on all that poppycock story about the gold, are you? Uncle Charlie huffed. Don't get so wound up, Charlie. We're just having fun after all, not organizing a hunt. Let Sean answer. Well, I'm not a big believer in tall tales, but I believe there's some truth to them. But I'm not going to drop out of society and spend the rest of my life in search of the lost Dutchman, if that's what you mean. Bob chuckled. A good answer. He leaned forward like he was going to impart something secret no one else would hear. Well, there's this legend about Mosby's men that isn't widely known or believed. He shot a glance at Uncle Charlie, who guffed. But it's interesting, and it centers around your new homestead, you might say. Oh really? Let's hear it, Sean stated flatly. trying his best not to show too much enthusiasm. "First, you gotta understand, Mosby's command were guerrillas." "I've got that. I'm familiar with the concept," Sean acknowledged. "Well, Mosby's bunch was a lot more disciplined than some of the other guerrilla units such as the Quantrills, but he did have a bad element. They just weren't the majority. I'm explaining this so you understand how this story is possible. In a conventional unit, it wouldn't have been. But with a unit like the 43rd, there was more freedom of operation." Bob paused for effect before continuing, and Sean nodded that he understood. "Well, in their free time, some of Mosby's command was given to running little raids of their own." "More like common highwaymen," Uncle Charlie interrupted. Bob fixed him with an icy stare. "If you won't tell it, be my guest," Bob shot back. Charlie just harumphed and sat silently. "Anyway, where was I?" Bob said, dismissing Charlie by flicking an imaginary speck off his shoulder. "Okay, during one of these raids, the Rangers ended up with a wagon loaded with an unascertained quantity of gold. Well, to make a long story short, they split up after spotting a Union patrol coming their way. They knew they couldn't outrun it with the wagon, and naturally they didn't just want to up and leave it. So 3 men stayed with the wagon. The rest turned and showed themselves to the patrol and led it off in the other direction, letting the slow-moving wagon escape. They would rendezvous later back in the Confederacy where it was relatively safe." Sean looked up and saw all 3 women standing there in the kitchen doorway listening intently. Jessie was bug-eyed, and Abby was chewing her lip. Only Abby's mother seemed unruffled. Did one of them say something? He wondered. Then he dismissed the idea. He was just being paranoid. Abruptly, Cyrus got up and declared, "All this talk is making me thirsty. Who wants a beer?" and made his way into the kitchen. "Can you guess what happened next, Sean?" Bob asked, leaning even further forward in his seat. Uncle Charlie leaned forward too, almost spellbound despite himself. Cyrus returned, handing each man a bottle, and returned to his seat. The wagon disappeared, and nobody ever saw the 3 men or wagon ever again. Sean answered in a neutral voice, hiding his excitement. Bob looked smugly around the room, enjoying himself. "Not quite. The 3 men turned up a few days later, when they skirmished with a routine Union patrol doing a sweep of the local farms trying to round up Mosby or any of his men." His smug grin grew wider. "Can you guess where?" he asked. Sean snapped his fingers in mock astonishment. "At my place." "Very good, Sean. Yes, they had quite a shootout at your farm called Wheatland. All 3 men were killed rather than being taken prisoner. Kind of odd in itself for the time, but all 3 men died. The Union patrol recovered a freight wagon the owner claimed wasn't his. But no gold was ever found, and no clues as to its whereabouts have ever surfaced." "That's because the whole story is crock," Uncle Charlie blurted. "And utter crock, and you know it, Robert." Uncle Charlie was turning red, like he was going to explode, but Bob was enjoying himself. "That's not all, Sean. It gets better. It seems one of the 3, as it turns out, was sweet on the daughter of the family that lived in that house. A young man by the name of Wilt Binford, I believe. Well, they say at night on the full moon, Wilt's ghost walks the area trying to show his lost love where the gold is hidden. That whole story is hogwash, and you know it." Sean shook his head in disbelief. "Sounds to me like a good story for around a campfire or on a hayride. How much can be proven beyond a doubt, though?" "I don't know. No part of it has ever actually been documented," Bob admitted, shrugging. "Just bits and pieces of other stories tie in with it, and when you take them away, it's what you have left. Take, for instance, you yourself said the house seemed to have been shot up, did you not? Well, that was your battle." "What about the last part?" Sean asked. "The last part, Sean? Come on now. You don't believe in spooks, do ya?" Bob laughed. No, Sean said, explaining. "I mean the part about the young man." "What did you say his name was?" Sean asked innocently. "Wilt Binford," Bob answered. "Why?" "I found an old photo of a teenage couple. The boy was in a Confederate uniform." My. Well, you said yourself tall tales usually have something in them that's fact. That's probably true parts of this story. I mean, you haven't found any of my gold just lying about, have you?" "Speaking of what Sean found at the house, Why don't we head over and y'all can see how far he's come with the house and take a look at all the goodies? And Jesse and I can finish the inventory we started yesterday. Uncle Charlie and Bob, I'm sure Sean doesn't mind if y'all come too, Abby suggested. A splendid idea, young lady. That way we can stop your brother's bored ghost stories, Uncle Charlie bristled. I second the motion. That is, if you don't mind, Sean, Bob said, getting to his feet and stretching. And, by the way, don't let Uncle Charlie's ranting get to you. He just feels like an old fool whenever the topic of Mosby's gold comes up. Spent 15 years of his life trying to find it and put together the facts behind the story. Charlie stormed out of the room. Cyrus followed after him to calm down his old friend. Everyone watched them go as Bob laughed cruelly. Abby explained, "What my dear brother didn't tell you is that Charlie was so convinced he was on to something and so fanatical about it, he would spend the night of the full moon out near there trying to spot the ghost and see if he'd tell him where the gold was. He was completely obsessed. Then, one night, the ghost appeared and spoke to him." With this, Sean started to speak his disbelief. Abby held up her hand to silence him until she finished. "The ghost appeared and spoke to him, led him all over the property to a huge rock that appeared to be solid gold. Charlie flung himself on the rock and wept. Then Bob and some of his fraternity brothers jumped from cover with flashlights and laughed at him. And to make matters worse, the rock, you see, had been painted and wasn't dry. When Charlie flung himself on the rock and hugged it, he covered himself with gold paint. It was in a secluded spot and a long walk back to his car. The boys taunted him and humiliated him the whole way. I don't think he ever quite got over it. Any mention of that story sends him into a rage," Abby ended sadly. "Ah, y'all should have seen him, the old fool," Bob laughed. "What a sight he was." Sean tried to keep the distaste from his voice when he asked Bob, "So, you don't believe that tale of gold then?" "Not a chance," Bob sneered. "Did you make up the haunt too?" Sean pushed. "No, that's an old tale like the gold. I just made it happen." He snapped his fingers and grinned a cruel grin. "What made me think of it, though, was Charlie used to swear he'd seen a ghost years ago when he was young, so we played right into it when I made the ghost appear for real." "That was a cruel thing to do," Sean observed. Bob's look was instantly icy. "Oh, so you never played a prank on anyone as a young man, I suppose?" "Nobody does anything that cruel for fun," Abby snapped. "Daddy told me that Charlie confided in him years ago that he was humiliated so bad he contemplated suicide." "That's as much bullshit as the gold story," Bob said defensively. "If I thought that was true, I probably wouldn't have done it. Like if the gold story was true." "If the gold story was true, what?" Sean asked, developing a dislike for Bob very quickly. Bob looked Sean in the eye with a very cold stare. "If I for one moment believed that story, I would have taken that house apart board by board and turned over every stone in the county and stomped on anyone who got in my way until I found it. I wouldn't have played hide and seek with that old fool," Bob said, sneering with a wicked glint in his eye. Then he turned and went outside, leaving Sean, Abby, Jesse, and Elizabeth Dalton staring after him. "Sometimes I just don't understand that boy," Elizabeth said, shaking her head. "He makes me gag," Jessie said, imitating sticking her finger down her throat. "You see what I mean about my brother being a little weird?" Abby said, watching her brother walk across the front lawn. "Yeah, your Uncle Charlie seems like a nice old guy, though," Sean said, following Abby's gaze. Abby just nodded. "Well, let's get going," Sean said, changing the subject. "Are you coming, Mrs. Dalton?" "Oh, heavens no! I don't get excited by old things the way everyone else in the family does, but thank you for asking," she said, smiling pleasantly. "Come on, Gran, it'll be fun. Wait until you see the string of pearls Sean gave me and the brooch he gave Mama," Jessie bragged. "Are you sure, Mama?" Abby asked, concerned, not wanting to leave her mother out. "I'm sure, dear. Now you kids run along and have fun before old Pops out there gets antsy. I'm sure your house looks fine, Sean. I'll see it some other time if that's okay." "Well, I'd love to have you over any time. And thank you for having me. The food was great." Sean spoke sincerely, patting his full stomach. "Why, thank you, Sean. Come back." She turned to her daughter. "I think you got yourself a nice one this time, girl. Don't let him get away. Abby, why don't you bring Sean back next Sunday for Easter dinner? You don't have any plans yet, do you, Sean? Elizabeth Dalton asked. Well, actually, I'm going out of town for a couple days. I should be back before the weekend, but my little brother was coming down from Ohio to spend some time. I don't want to intrude, he said humbly. Nonsense, bring your brother too. We love to have y'all here with us. Well, Sean looked at Abby, who nodded yes eagerly. Okay, as long as it's okay with Eric. He and I haven't seen much of each other lately, but I'm sure we'll be here. Thank you. Fine, there'll be plenty of food. I look forward to you both. Now run along before war develops between those three outside. They all laughed and said goodbyes, and walked out to Abby's BMW. Her mother followed them out to the front porch and waved them goodbye. They found the others waiting by Abby's blue BMW in front of the old Smitty antique shop, in Cyrus's old red Chevy pickup. Bob sat morosely in the back. Bob, you can ride with us if you want, Abby offered, not really wanting Bob with them, but not wanting to be rude to him either. I'm fine where I sit, he replied neutrally. Abby shrugged. Suit yourself. And she, Sean, and Jesse piled in. Abby gunned the engine with a throaty roar, and they were off. God, I'm glad Uncle Bobby didn't want to come with us, Jesse said with a shudder. So am I, dear, but it's gonna be chilly in the back of that truck, and no matter what he acts like sometimes, I can't will that on my own brother. Abby answered with a sigh, which Sean thought was noble. I'd let the asshole freeze, he thought. Jesse blurted, Do you think Uncle Bobby knows anything? I mean, asking you being a treasure hunter, then telling his story almost like he knew, and wanted to see how you'd react. Weird. Sean looked over at Abby. Why didn't you tell me about the feud when you mentioned to me about the legend of Mosby's gold? He asked, arching his eyebrows at her. Abby shrugged. I don't like to talk about what Bob did, and I didn't realize Uncle Charlie would be there today. We learned a lot more from them than I thought we would. If either one of them thought we were onto something, they wouldn't have said a word about it. But one thing is for sure, she said, biting her lip, trying to find the right words as she expertly maneuvered her car around a tight bend. What's that? Sean asked, watching the road, admiring Abby's touch with the wheel. Abby sneaked a quick glance at Sean, then back at the road before answering. Bob's lying about not believing the story, or at least the premise of it, she shared. Why would he lie about that, Mama? Jesse asked, leaning forward between the seats to be closer to the conversation. Abby shook her head. I don't know, Jess. I just don't know. But I do know he's looked for it off and on since he first heard the tale as a kid. He helped Uncle Charlie on a lot of the research Charlie did, trying to get to the bottom of the tale. Reading endlessly through old letters, interviews, stories from survivors of the war that might help the pieces fall into place. Uncle Charlie still believes it, for that matter. I've heard them both talking about it candidly on the phone or to Daddy, and I saw a map Bob had. He'd been working on it for a long time, eliminating places they had looked. Actually, there's a lot of reasons he might choose to lie about it, Sean said, his brow knitted together in thought. One reason they'd both lie about it is they don't trust each other or they don't want to share denial. Makes it seem less likely that each would be looking over their shoulder for the other. Bob's whole prank was probably designed to deflate Uncle Charlie, to make him quit looking because Bob thought he was close himself. Gold seems to do strange things to people, he added. I believe that, Jessie said with awe in her voice. It seemed to sort of hypnotize everyone last night when it was in the light. Remember? Nobody could concentrate on what we were talking about until you covered it up. That it did, Sean agreed, nodding. We need a game plan, Sean stated, looking at the women, especially with me having to go out of town Tuesday. Where are you going? Jessie questioned curiously. Well, I got my first assignment for the security company I work for. I'm flying out to Miami to review the security setup for some rich oil guy. Pretty routine stuff, actually. Sean shrugged, but I have to go into DC tomorrow. I'll see what information I can tap into about this stuff from the company computer. They have an amazing database that can tie into all kinds of security agencies, finance agencies, and history departments. Maybe I can get a line on some names in the letter, any descendants, that sort of thing. Or ask my boss how to dispose of a large amount of gold bullion without drawing a lot of undue attention to ourselves. Don't you mean yourself? Abby asked, flashing a look at him. Aren't you two planning on giving me a hand? Sean asked, looking puzzled, first at Abby, then at Jessie, who was nodding an enthusiastic yes. Of course, Abby said, but the gold was in your house. It is yours after all. What if we don't find the rest? What if it's hidden on someone else's property? What if someone gets to it before we do? What if? Number one, we do have one bar that's worth at least $150K. You guys were there when I found it, so I plan on sharing whatever we find with you two and Jack. Fair enough? You don't have to do that, Abby said, looking at him guardedly. I know I don't, but I'm going to, Sean said with finality in his voice. No one said anything for a long minute. That settles that, Sean said. First thing is to not come out and tell anybody about the find. We need to find out as much as we possibly can about the area during the time this happened, when exactly that was, and as much as we can about the people whose names are mentioned. Abby, can you tell Jessie what we talked about earlier? Maybe she can read through Myra's diaries and learn a few things, or at least fill in some of the grays. Abby nodded. I know a few local historians, and some of the same people Bob and Uncle Charlie talked to. I'll try to get another look at Bob's map, do some snooping about what he really knows. He doesn't hide it or anything, it's just nobody ever bothered to look, she shrugged. Good. When I get back, we'll put our heads together and see if we've learned anything. My brother Eric is coming in this weekend for Easter. We'll bring him in on it too, if you don't mind. They both nodded in agreement as Sean continued. He's had a tough time lately, but he has a good head on his shoulders. They finished the short drive and pulled into Sean's driveway. Abby gasped. They all followed her gaze, and their hearts jumped into their throats when they saw the front door standing open. Abby pulled to a stop quickly, and they jumped out of the car and were assailed by the blaring sounds of alarms coming from the tent in the house. You two stay here, Sean ordered and got out of the car. He approached the tent cautiously. Sean didn't sense any danger, but entered the tent cautiously anyway. Things were open, scattered, but nothing seemed broken or taken. He switched off the alarms quickly, and the clatter stopped. He could still hear the alarms sounding in the house. Sean exited the tent and headed toward the house. Abby and Jessie were just outside of the car, but staying close to it, concern etched on their faces. He called over. Everything seems okay in there, but a little messy. Check it out. You two were in there last. Please, before our guests arrive. I suppose we're keeping this to ourselves too? Abby shot him a worried tone. You got it, sister, Sean called, and disappeared into the house. He went quickly to the main control panel for the alarm system he'd installed. No penetration past getting the door open. He noticed on the panel that told him what space had been violated. He went to the rear of the house and saw that where he had hidden the gold hadn't been disturbed. Things were getting interesting. He felt the familiar adrenaline rush, but had more to worry about now. Abby and Jessie. Like they had read his mind, he heard their footsteps on the porch. Sean, he heard Abby call. It's okay. Come on in, he heard himself answer. Movement outside the window caught his attention. With a quick glance outside, he saw two black men fleeing into the woods. Interesting indeed, he thought. He turned and smiled as Abby came into the room. Nothing, he said. Bullshit, she blurted, and rushed into his arms. I was so worried, she said, burying her head in his shoulder. It's okay, he reassured. This concludes part 1.